Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into something huge, maybe the defining geopolitical shift of our time, China's incredible rapid rise to great power status this century.
It really is, but the fascinating thing, the puzzle we're exploring, isn't just that China rose, it's how they managed it.
Right, how did they pull it off without setting off major alarm bells in Washington much earlier, without triggering some kind of decisive preventative action from the U.S.?
Exactly. That's the core question. And we're digging into the framework laid out in Oriana Schuyler Mastro's book, Upstart. It's quite insightful.
Oh, yes. Upstart.
Her argument basically is that this wasn't some accident of history. It was a very deliberate three-part strategy. Think emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship, all working together.
Okay.
And the whole point was carefully calibrated to delay the U.S. really seeing the threat until China had built up so much power that, well, Washington's options became pretty limited.
Okay, let's unpack that strategy. For a country like China, taking this path, there must be a really deep-seated motivation behind it all. Where did this intense drive come from?
Oh, it's visceral. Absolutely. Deeply historical. You have to go back to the century of humiliation. That narrative is incredibly powerful in China.
Right, the feeling of being subjugated by foreign powers for so long.
Precisely. And the Communist Party's legitimacy is fundamentally tied, even today, to restoring China's global standing. But the real starting gun for the modern strategy, you could argue, was 1991, the Gulf War.
The Gulf War. I remember reading how much of a shock that was, particularly for the PLA, seeing U.S. military tech in action.
It was a massive wake-up call, absolutely brutal and televised. The Chinese leadership, military and political, they watched the U.S. just dismantle the Iraqi military with precision, speed, digital integration.
They just couldn't match.
Not even close. They realized they weren't just a bit behind. They were, strategically speaking, maybe decades behind. And that huge gap, that realization, it fueled this intense, almost desperate push to modernize, to regain what they see as their rightful place.
Okay, so they know they're way behind, and they know that a rapid military and economic buildup is going to look threatening inherently. So what becomes the absolute #1 strategic priority?
Managing the U.S. response. As simple as that. CCP leaders, right from Jiang Zemin through Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping, they all understood it. The biggest existential threat wasn't, internal unrest or some regional conflict. It was triggering decisive U.S. hostility too early.
So the goal was this incredible balancing act.
Monumental, yeah. Build up overwhelming national power, economic, diplomatic, military, but to do it while looking as much as possible like you're not a threat, like you're a non-revisionist power.
Which is where Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase comes in.
Exactly. Taoguan Yangwei. Bide your time and hide your strengths, or sometimes translated as hide your capabilities and bide your time.
And we should stress, this wasn't just a catchy slogan, was it? It became actual doctrine.
Oh, absolutely. It was the core of Chinese foreign and defense policy for decades. It meant strategic patience, focus internally on economic development, avoid big, flashy, provocative moves on the world stage.
Keep the U.S. focused elsewhere.
Let the U.S. worry about the Middle East, Russia, terrorism, whatever. Give China the breathing room, the space it needed to grow its strength, kind of in the shadows. The whole Upstart strategy we're discussing today, really, is how they put that philosophy into action.
Okay, so that brings us right to the framework itself, the 3 E's. If the main goal was delaying U.S. recognition, hiding the buildup until it was basically too late, how did these 3 approaches help China balance actually being effective with, well, camouflage?
Yeah, the framework is essentially the blueprint for how they approach different domains of power. It breaks down into 3 distinct strategies, but they often overlap and reinforce each other.
Let's take the first one, emulation. What does that involve?
Okay, so emulation is probably the most visible part. It's about consciously copying what the established power, the U.S., does successfully. Think about institutions, strategies, capabilities.
Like joining the WTO or building aircraft carriers eventually.
Exactly. Participating in the U.S.-led international order, the UN, the WTO, WHO, you name it. Adopting market mechanisms, even if state-controlled ones. Developing military doctrines that at least sound familiar internationally. It's like taking the well-trodden path.
And that serves 2 purposes, right?
2 critical purposes. First, it gives them ready-made capacity. You don't have to reinvent the wheel entirely. Second, and maybe more importantly in the early stages, it's a powerful tool for reassurance.
How so?
Well, if China looks like it's playing by the existing rules, joining the clubs, acting like a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder.
Then Washington is less likely to see it as an immediate existential threat trying to tear everything down.
Precisely. It lowers the threat perception, it buys time, it's brilliant camouflage, as you said.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's emulation. The second E, exploitation, sounds a bit more calculated, maybe even sneaky.
It is more calculated. Exploitation is all about capitalizing on U.S. vulnerabilities, or maybe weaknesses, or even just areas the U.S. isn't paying much attention to, the blind spots.
What kind of blind spots?
Could be geographic areas, the U.S. discounts, like certain developing countries may be deemed less strategically vital at the time. Or it could be functional areas where the U.S. thinks it's already got the market cornered or global demand satisfied, so it gets a bit complacent.
Like development finance, perhaps.
Development finance is a great example we'll get into. But yeah, China looks for those seams, those gaps where U.S. focus or resources are thin, and then quietly moves in. Often in places the U.S. ignores, or maybe even places where U.S. laws or policies restrict American actors from going.
Okay, so emulation is visible, conforming. Exploitation is finding the gaps. That leaves the third E, entrepreneurship. This must be where China really leverages its unique system, right?
Right. Absolutely. Entrepreneurship is where China doesn't just copy or exploit gaps in the existing system, it innovates entirely new ways to build and project power. And this is where its unique political economic model, this sort of capitalist authoritarian state, really comes into play.
How does that model give it an entrepreneurial edge?
Well, think about the ability to mobilize massive resources almost overnight through state directives. Centralized control allows for long-term strategic bets that might be difficult in a purely market-driven democratic system, subordinating short-term market logic to long-term national goals.
So things like the Belt and Road Initiative or maybe the A2AD military strategy.
Those are perfect examples of entrepreneurship. They represent fundamentally different approaches, leveraging China's specific strengths and circumstances rather than just mirroring the U.S.
And the key thread tying all three,
Yeah.
emulation, exploitation, entrepreneurship, is this deliberate goal of delaying recognition. Why is timing, delaying that recognition, so absolutely critical in this great power game?
Because the whole game for a rising power is to close the gap, ideally reach something close to parity, before the dominant power fully wakes up and decides it needs to stop the rise, potentially through conflict, which would be catastrophic for everyone, but especially for the rising power if it happens too soon.
So China used this mix, reassurance through emulation, quiet gains through exploitation, leaps forward through entrepreneurship.
To keep Washington uncertain, to muddy the waters about China's true strength and, crucially, its ultimate intentions. Was it a status quo power just wanting its place? Or was it truly revisionist? They made it hard to draw a clear, alarming line until much later.
They were effective, but also patient.
Strategically patient, yes, letting the power gap shrink incrementally until, by the time the U.S. really sounded the alarm, the options for pushing back were much less attractive, much more costly, and much riskier.
Now, before we move on, we have to touch on this constant internal factor you mentioned. The absolute imperative for the CCP to maintain control. How does that shape the way China actually uses these strategies? Does it ever get in the way?
It's a fundamental constraint, absolutely critical for listeners to understand. For the CCP, maintaining internal control, political stability, regime security that trumps almost everything else.
Even pure strategic optimization sometimes.
Often, yes. Take the example of the currency, the RMB. Strategically, making it fully convertible might boost its global status, challenging the dollar. It's an emulation goal.
But that introduces risks the party won't tolerate.
Exactly. Risks like massive capital flight, loss of monetary control, those risks are seen as threatening the party's grip. So the strategically optimal move for global power is rejected because of the domestic political imperative.
So the authoritarian system is a double-edged sword.
It is. It's an entrepreneurial advantage when it comes to mobilizing resources for something like Made in China 2025. But it's a strategic hindrance when it comes to things like true economic integration or, as we'll see, soft power. That internal tension is always there, shaping the choices.
Okay, let's dive into specific domains. Diplomacy and international institutions seem like a perfect place to see emulation and exploitation in action. China very deliberately engaged with the U.S.-led system, didn't it? but not just to be a good global citizen.
Oh, definitely not just for altruism. It was highly strategic. Choosing emulation here meant becoming, in their words, a constructive builder within institutions like the UN, the WTO, the World Health Organization.
Why join the club instead of trying to tear it down or build a rival system right away?
Several reasons. It conferred legitimacy, it gave them access to information and influence, and crucially, it reassured Washington. Joining the system signals you're not, at least initially, trying to overthrow it. It allowed them to learn the rules and start shaping them from the inside.
And from China's perspective, there's a real efficiency argument here too, isn't there? Letting the U.S. foot most of the bill.
Hugely efficient. China essentially got to leverage the global order that the U.S. had built and was largely bankrolling. I mean, look at the UN funding. As of 2021, the U.S. was paying something like 5.5 times more into the overall UN system than China was,
So China gets the benefits of stability, the platform for influence.
without bearing the full, often crushing financial burden of maintaining that order. They could free ride to a significant extent while incrementally increasing their own contributions and therefore their say in areas that mattered most to them. Smart power, really.
And that growing influence isn't just abstract. We can see it in the data on who's actually running these organizations.
The shift has been quite dramatic, yeah. If you looked around the year 2000 across maybe 30 major international and regional bodies, basically zero top executive roles were held by Chinese nationals.
Zero.
Zero. Fast forward to 2015, and that figure jumped to 21% representation in those top jobs. And by 2021, here's a key stat. Chinese citizens headed 4 out of the 15 UN specialized agencies. That was actually more than the U.S. held at the time, which was 3.
That's significant. Having your person at the top lets you influence agendas, staffing, technical standards.
Absolutely. It gives you enormous sway, often in areas far from the public spotlight, setting the norms and rules that govern global interactions in everything from telecommunications to aviation.
Okay, so emulation got them in the door and into leadership positions. Now let's talk exploitation in this context. Finding those institutional gaps where the U.S. was maybe asleep at the wheel.
The International Seabed Authority, the ISA, is just a textbook example of this, probably the most critical one right now.
The ISA. Not exactly a household name. What does it do?
It's the UN body that regulates all mining and mineral exploration activities in the deep seabed, the vast areas beyond national coastlines. Think international waters.
And why was China so interested in this relatively obscure body?
Because for years, while the U.S. was maybe focused elsewhere, China was incredibly active in the ISA, attending every meeting, submitting technical proposals, getting its experts into key committees, shaping the rules of the game.
Why does deep-sea mining matter so much?
Because the deep seabed is potentially loaded with critical minerals. We're talking manganese nodules, cobalt crusts, polymetallic sulfides, stuff that contains huge amounts of nickel, cobalt, copper, rare earths.
All essential for the green transition, right? Batteries, wind turbines.
Exactly. Absolutely essential for EV batteries, renewable energy tech, high-end electronics. And here's the kicker. The United States, because it has never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS.
Right, UNCLS, that old chestnut.
The U.S. only has observer status at the ISA. It doesn't have a full vote. China, meanwhile, is a full voting member and has been shaping the mining code for years.
So China exploited a gap created by the U.S.'s own domestic political failure to join the treaty.
Precisely. While Washington was tied up in knots over UNCLOS, China was busy securing exploration contracts covering vast swaths of the seabed and gaining disproportionate influence over the rules that will govern future exploitation. Now, as the global scramble for these critical minerals heats up, China is positioned beautifully.
Wow, that's exploiting a blind spot with potentially massive long-term consequences.
Huge consequences. It's not just about resources, it's about controlling the regulatory environment for accessing those resources.
And this exploitation isn't limited to economic or resource issues. They've used their institutional positions, for example, in the UN Human Rights Council, quite effectively to push back on criticism, particularly over issues like Xinjiang.
Yes, this is another really astute application of exploitation. China learned that being inside these bodies, even ones ostensibly designed to uphold liberal norms, allows you to reshape those norms, or at least muddy the waters, rather than just comply.
How do they do that?
A key tactic, often coordinated with other authoritarian or developing nations, is to shift the focus. Move the debate away from uncomfortable substantive issues like political freedoms, civil rights, minority treatment, and focus instead on procedural arguments. Or try to redefine human rights altogether.
Well, you can find them how?
To prioritize economic development and social stability as the primary human rights, downplaying or dismissing Western emphasis on individual political and civil liberties. The right to development becomes the trump card.
And we saw a very clear example of this strategy succeeding not long ago.
The vote in the UN Human Rights Council in October 2022. That was really telling. The U.S. and a group of Western allies put forward a motion simply to hold a debate, not even a condemnation, just a debate on the human rights situation in Xinjiang.
And China managed to defeat it.
They defeated it narrowly by 2 votes. They successfully mobilized enough support, particularly from developing countries, many of which received significant Belt and Road funding, to block even a discussion. It was a major diplomatic victory for Beijing, showing they could use the very institutions of the liberal order to shield themselves from scrutiny and actively undermine Western human rights norms on the global stage.
Let's pivot now. Soft power. This seems like an area where China definitely tried emulation, right? Trying to build their own version of global cultural appeal, like Hollywood or the BBC. But it hasn't really worked out that well for them, has it?
No, it really hasn't, despite massive investment. The CCP officially made boosting soft power a national goal back in 2007. They recognized it was a key part of being a comprehensive great power.
So they poured money into it.
Billions, absolutely billions, into things like the Confucius Institutes globally, expanding state media like CGTN, funding cultural exchanges, promoting tourism, trying to sell the China story, focusing on ancient history, cultural achievements, the idea of the unity of the Chinese ethnicity.
But soft power, almost by definition, has to be attractive, somewhat organic. It seems hard to square that with tight party control.
That's exactly the core problem. You hit the nail on the head. After, 15, nearly 20 years and all that spending, China consistently languishes around 10th place in global soft power rankings, way behind the US, UK, Germany, Japan, Canada.
And public opinion reflects that failure, doesn't it?
Dramatically. Unfavorable views of China reached record highs in many developed nations around 2020, 2021. You saw polling, like from Pew Research, showing huge majorities in countries like Australia, Sweden, the US, UK expressing no confidence in Xi Jinping on world affairs. That's not the sign of successful soft power projection.
And even commercially, Chinese brands are everywhere, but they don't have that same global cultural cachet as, say, Apple or Nike or Toyota.
That's another key indicator. Huge manufacturing power, yes, but globally recognized and desired brands, very few break into the top 50 worldwide. It just hasn't translated.
So why keep pouring money in if it's not working internationally?
Well, that's the interesting part. It might be failing to win hearts and minds abroad, but the soft power push arguably serves a vital domestic purpose for the CCP.
Bolstering legitimacy at home.
Exactly. By constantly showcasing China's global activities, cultural programs, and supposed international importance through state media, it reinforces the narrative to the Chinese public that the party is restoring national greatness and respect on the world stage. So even if foreigners aren't buying it, it might still be working politically inside China. When control clashes with appeal, control wins.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift to arms sales. Here, it seems China avoids trying to emulate the U.S. as the world's policeman or top arms dealer, and instead focuses very shrewdly on exploitation.
That's right. They're not trying to match the sheer volume or global reach of U.S. arms sales. I mean, the U.S. sells roughly 9 times the quantity of weapons as China, reaching almost double the number of countries since 2001.
So what's China's niche? How do they exploit the market?
They focus intensely on 2 specific areas where the U.S., either by choice or by regulation, leaves a gap.
Okay, what's the first gap?
U.S. regulatory restrictions. A prime example is the Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR. For a long time, the MTCR essentially classified larger armed drones, UAVs, as cruise missiles.
Which severely restricted U.S. companies from exporting them, even to allies.
Correct. It created this huge artificial market vacuum for capable, long-range armed drones. And Chinese companies, often leveraging technology acquired through various means, including potentially forced transfer or reverse engineering, rushed in to fill that void.
With systems like the Wing Lung and the Kaihong drones.
Exactly. They became the go-to suppliers for countries that wanted that capability but couldn't get it from the U.S. or Europe. They exploited a self-imposed American restriction.
Okay, so exploiting U.S. regulations is one niche. What's the second?
Selling to clients the U.S. won't sell to. The unsavory clients, you might call them. Countries facing U.S. sanctions, or those with human rights concerns, or states Washington deems politically problematic.
China doesn't have the same comms.
Generally, no. Their official foreign policy doctrine is non-interference in internal affairs, so they are often willing to sell advanced systems, including those armed drones, to countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Nigeria, even places like Serbia where the U.S. might restrict sales due to end-use concerns or political factors.
So between 2003 and 2018, they sold quite a few drones into this niche.
The data suggests something like 181 armed UAVs delivered to 13 countries in that period, many of whom were frustrated by U.S. export controls or conditions.
So their non-interference policy isn't just diplomatic posturing, it's actually a really effective sales pitch in certain markets.
It absolutely is. It allows them to frame their arms sales as purely commercial transactions, devoid of the political baggage or conditionality that often comes with U.S. weapons deals. This reinforces their broader foreign policy narrative and their security model, while simultaneously carving out a profitable and strategically useful niche in the global arms market. It connects the dots nicely.
All right, let's tackle the military domain. This is obviously the riskiest area for a rising power, the one most likely to provoke the established hegemon. China seemed to delay its big military push, but when it came, it was a very careful mix, wasn't it? Some emulation for reassurance, but also some serious entrepreneurship for asymmetric advantage.
Absolutely. It was a real tightrope walk. They deliberately held back on comprehensive military modernization for a long time, prioritizing the economy. They knew that trying to directly match the U.S. global military footprint aircraft carriers everywhere, hundreds of overseas bases, was not only unaffordable, but incredibly provocative.
So suicide, basically.
Pretty much. They had to be smarter, more selective, more disruptive in specific ways.
So how did they use emulation selectively in the military sphere? What was the goal there?
The goal was mainly reassurance and capacity building in ways that looked legitimate and non-threatening. So they talk about modernizing to fight local wars under informatized conditions.
Which sounds technical, maybe a bit defensive.
Right. It sounds like standard military modernization for self-defense, not global conquest. And crucially, they heavily leaned into participating in what the military calls military operations other than war, or MOTW.
What does that include?
Things like counter-piracy, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and especially UN peacekeeping operations, UMPAOs. These activities present the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, as an army of peace, contributing to global stability.
And the UN peacekeeping is a big one for them, isn't it?
It's become a really significant part of their military diplomacy and capacity building. They started deploying ships to the Gulf of Aden for anti-piracy patrols back in 2009. That gave them invaluable blue water naval experience.
And they contribute a lot of troops to UN missions.
They're the 8th largest troop contributor overall, but significantly, they've contributed more personnel to UN PKOs since 2009 than any other permanent member of the UN Security Council. That buys a lot of goodwill, particularly in the developing world, and gives their troops vital operational experience, logistics, working in coalitions, dealing with complex environments.
But earlier, you mentioned China's strategy often involves cost efficiency, like free riding on UN funding. Does that apply to peacekeeping too? It sounds expensive to send troops.
But here's the clever calibration. They contribute personnel, which gives them the visibility, the experience, the soft power benefits, but they contribute relatively less financially to the overall UNPKO budget compared to their economic weight.
So they get the operational and diplomatic bang for less buck?
Exactly. In the 2020-2021 budget cycle, for instance, China's assessed contribution to the peacekeeping budget was about 15%. The U.S. share was 28%. So China maximizes the strategic benefits while minimizing the drain on resources that could be used for, say, building more missiles.
Speaking of which, they also seem to use emulation in arms control talks, but perhaps strategically.
Yes, this is a subtler point, but important. China became much more active in multilateral arms control forums, discussions around an arms trade treaty, rules for outer space, cyber norms.
Not necessarily because they plan to strictly adhere to everything.
But because participating, and sometimes even proposing restrictions, often serve to constrain the United States disproportionately. The U.S. military relies heavily on space dominance, global arms exports, cyber capabilities. So supporting international controls in these areas, even if imperfectly implemented, can be a way to level the playing field somewhat by tying the hands of the stronger power.
Okay, very clever. Now let's get to the heart of their military strategy, the real game changer. Anti-accessoria denial, or A2AD. This feels like pure entrepreneurship.
It absolutely is. A2AD is the crown jewel, the assassin's mace, as it's sometimes called. It fundamentally rejects the U.S. model of needing to project power globally. Instead, it focuses entirely on denying the U.S. the ability to project power into China's near seas.
It exploits a core U.S. vulnerability, doesn't it?
Totally. The U.S. military model depends on being able to sail its carrier strike groups, fly its advanced aircraft, and sustain logistics relatively close to a potential conflict zone. A2AD is designed to make that incredibly dangerous, potentially impossible, especially within the so-called First Island chain.
Define the first island chain for us again.
It's that string of islands running from Japan down through Taiwan, the Philippines, Borneo, basically China's maritime backyard. The goal of A2AD is to create a keep-out zone, a dense web of threats, missiles, submarines, mines, cyber attacks that would inflict unacceptable losses on any U.S. force trying to operate inside it.
And how do they build this capability so effectively?
Through highly focused asymmetric investment. Instead of matching U.S. carriers, they poured resources into missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, short-range, medium-range, intermediate range.
Numbers really grew quickly.
Exponentially, almost. Between roughly 2005 and 2022, their inventory of conventional short and medium-range ballistic missiles alone went from maybe 750 to over 1,100. And importantly, they developed specific carrier killer missiles like the DF-21D and DF-26.
And this is where the cost asymmetry really bites, right? That's the entrepreneurial genius, arguably.
It's the killer app, economically speaking. Why try to build a $13 billion U.S. Ford-class supercarrier, plus the billions more for its escort ships and aircraft wing, when theoretically China can threaten or even disable that entire multi-billion-dollar investment with a single missile that might cost, say, $18 million.
The strategic math just doesn't work for the U.S. in that scenario.
It becomes terrifyingly unfavorable. A relatively small investment in missile technology can hold hostage vastly more expensive U.S. power projection assets. That's the essence of asymmetric warfare, and China has mastered it in the maritime domain.
And the impact on U.S. military thinking has been profound.
It's forced a massive, painful reassessment. Top U.S. military leaders openly admit the U.S. no longer enjoys uncontested dominance in the Western Pacific. Repeated war games simulating a conflict over Taiwan, for instance, increasingly show the U.S. struggling, potentially losing, if forced to fight inside China's A2AD bubble.
Okay, beyond A2AD, what about other forms of military entrepreneurship? Gray zone warfare comes up a lot.
Yes, gray zone tactics are another key innovation. It's about changing the facts on the ground or in the sea incrementally, using actions that fall below the threshold of triggering a full-blown military conflict.
Like the island building in the South China Sea.
That's the classic example. Dredging sand, building artificial islands, militarizing them with runways and radar, all done gradually, often using Coast Guard or maritime militia vessels, blurring the lines between civilian and military action. It makes it very hard for the U.S. or regional powers to respond decisively without looking like the aggressor.
And they use the three warfares concept here.
Right. Public opinion warfare, shaping narratives, psychological warfare, intimidation, creating uncertainty, and legal warfare or lawfare.
How does lawfare work in this context?
Lawfare involves using or sometimes misusing legal arguments and frameworks to achieve strategic goals. In South China Sea, China constantly invokes contested historical rights and selectively interprets international law to justify its claims and challenge U.S. freedom of navigation operations.
And they cleverly use the U.S. failure to ratify UNCLS against Washington.
All the time, they consistently point out that the U.S. criticizes China for not following maritime law, while the U.S. itself refuses to even join the main treaty governing it. It's a way to undermine U.S. legitimacy and create legal ambiguity, paralyzing effective counterarguments.
Finally, on the military front, their approach to protecting their growing overseas interests is also quite different from the U.S. model. Very entrepreneurial.
Totally different. The U.S. relies on a massive, incredibly expensive global network of permanent military bases. China looked at that and said, no thanks.
So what's their alternative?
They have only one official overseas military base, in Djibouti. Instead of garrisons everywhere, they use a much lighter, hybrid approach. They rely heavily on host nation security forces, like getting Pakistan to create special forces just to protect CPEC projects. They use Chinese police officers deployed abroad in some cases, private security contractors, PSCs, and their contributions to UN peacekeeping missions also put personnel in key regions.
Much cheaper, much lower profile, much more politically flexible.
Exactly. It avoids the massive costs and political baggage of maintaining large foreign bases, minimizes direct military exposure, and fits their narrative of non-interference even as their global interests expand rapidly.
Let's turn to the economy. This is where China's rise has arguably had the most direct impact globally, and where the Upstart strategy is really visible. Let's start with how they use economic coercion learning from U.S. sanctions, perhaps, but adapting the method.
Yes, they definitely observed the power the U.S. wields through sanctions, but they adopted a distinct, more entrepreneurial approach to economic coercion themselves.
How is it different?
The key difference is deniability and flexibility. Unlike Western sanctions, which are usually formally declared, legislated, and publicly announced, China's economic coercion is often undeclared, informal, and relies on opaque administrative measures.
Like what?
Sudden regulatory hurdles, arbitrary customs inspections finding problems, state-encouraged consumer boycotts, unexplained delays in approvals, cutting off tourism flows, manipulating state-owned enterprise purchasing decisions. It's often hard to definitively prove it's state-directed coercion, which gives Beijing plausible deniability.
And what's the main goal of this coercion? Is it just about trade disputes?
Rarely. The primary goal is almost always political, to deter or punish other countries for actions the CCP sees as harmful to its core interests or legitimacy.
Like what kind of actions?
Criticizing China's policies in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, upgrading ties with Taiwan, meeting with the Dalai Lama, questioning the origins of COVID-19, deploying U.S. missile defense systems.
Can you give a specific example of how this works?
The pressure campaign against Australia after they called for an independent inquiry into COVID's origins is a classic case. There were no formal sanctions declared, but suddenly Australian barley faced huge tariffs due to supposed dumping. Beef exports were suspended from several abattoirs over labeling issues. Wine imports were hit with massive duties. Coal shipments were stranded offshore for months.
All technically justifiable under trade rules, perhaps, but the timing and scale made the political message clear.
Absolutely clear. It was targeted punishment designed to make Canberra rethink its stance. We saw similar things with South Korea over the TED missile defense system. Lotte supermarkets suddenly faced closures across China due to supposed fire safety violations. Or the NBA getting temporarily pulled from Chinese TV after a team manager tweeted support for Hong Kong. It's flexible, deniable, and often quite effective at chilling criticism.
Okay. Now, what about trying to challenge the U.S. dollar's dominance? That seems like a major emulation play.
It definitely was, and still is, an ambition. China recognized the enormous geopolitical leverage the U.S. gets from the dollar being the world's primary reserve currency and medium of exchange. So they've made efforts to promote the international use of their own currency, the renminbi, or RMB.
How do they try to do that?
Key moves included getting the RMB included in the IMF's basket of currencies that make up the special drawing right, the SDR. That was a big symbolic win. They also pushed for bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing trade to be settled directly in RMB and the partner currency, bypassing the dollar.
But here we bump up against that internal tension again, don't we?
Yeah.
The need for party control, limiting the emulation effort.
Exactly. This is where the ambition crashes into the reality of CCP priorities. Despite all these efforts, the U.S. dollar remains overwhelmingly dominant. In 2022, it still accounted for nearly 60% of global central bank reserves.
And the RMB.
Still tiny in comparison, only about 2.76%. The fundamental roadblock is that China still maintains strict capital controls and does not allow the RMB to be freely convertible.
Why not? Wouldn't that boost its international use?
It probably would, yes. But the party fears that full convertibility would mean losing control over capital flows. They worry about massive amounts of money leaving the country, destabilizing the financial system, and ultimately undermining their political control. So the goal of challenging the dollar is subordinated to the non-negotiable imperative of maintaining domestic financial stability and party authority.
Which leads us nicely into economic entrepreneurship. If pure emulation of the U.S. free market globalized currency model has limits, China developed its own state-driven alternative, right?
Absolutely. This is where they lean heavily into their unique state capitalist system. There's a fundamental rejection of the U.S. laissez-faire ideology. The CCP believes the state must actively guide and direct the economy to achieve strategic national goals, even if it means overcutting market forces or reining in successful private entrepreneurs.
The Jack Ma situation being a famous example.
A very public example of the party reminding everyone who's ultimately in charge. They can't fully replicate the bottom-up, sometimes chaotic, innovation engine of Silicon Valley. So they built a top-down, state-directed alternative.
And the flagship initiative here is Made in China 2025.
Yes. Launched in 2015, this is industrial policy on an unprecedented scale. It's a state-led mobilization using everything in the toolkit: massive subsidies, state-backed investment funds, guidance to banks, explicit targets for domestic market share, pressure for foreign companies to transfer technology, and, controversially, widespread cyber espionage to acquire foreign tech secrets.
All aimed at achieving self-reliance and global leadership in key high-tech sectors.
10 key sectors initially identified things like electric vehicles, robotics, aerospace, advanced medical devices, semiconductors, AI, high-end software. The goal is to move China up the value chain and reduce reliance on foreign technology.
And have they seen success with this model?
In some areas, absolutely spectacular disruptive success. Solar panel manufacturing is the poster child. China poured something like $50 billion into building up its domestic industry, achieved massive economies of scale, and then arguably dumped exports onto the global market at below-cost prices,
Driving out Western competitors.
decimating them, resulting in China now dominating something like 80% of the global solar supply chain across all stages. It was a ruthless but incredibly effective use of state power to capture a strategic industry. And overall, some analyses suggest China's national innovation capacity reached maybe 75% of U.S. levels by 2020, showing rapid catch-up.
But it's not all successes. There are areas where the state-led model struggles.
Right, definitely. Semiconductors remain the major bottleneck, the Achilles heel. Despite pouring hundreds of billions into trying to build a world-class domestic chip industry, China still remains heavily dependent on foreign imports for the most advanced chips and the complex equipment needed to make them.
Why the struggle there?
Cutting-edge semiconductor innovation seems to require a level of global collaboration, open knowledge sharing, and specialized expertise across a vast, intricate supply chain that China's more top-down, state-controlled, and sometimes secretive system finds very difficult to replicate. It highlights the limits of purely state-driven entrepreneurship in the most complex tech frontiers.
Okay, final piece of economic entrepreneurship. Development finance, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. How is this different from traditional Western aid?
BRI is fundamentally different, and that's what makes it entrepreneurial. First, what China primarily offers isn't traditional foreign aid, or ODA, official development assistance, which often comes with strings attached about governance or human rights.
Instead, they offer
Mostly large-scale loans, classified as other official flows, or OF. And these loans are overwhelmingly targeted at building hard infrastructure: ports, railways, highways, power plants, pipelines.
why is focusing on OOF for infrastructure entrepreneurial?
Several reasons. First, it helps solve a domestic problem for China, finding overseas markets for its massive industrial overcapacity in sectors like steel, cement, and construction equipment. Build infrastructure abroad using Chinese materials and companies.
Smart. What else?
Second, it's an effective way to put China's vast foreign exchange reserves to work, earning potentially higher returns than just holding U.S. Treasury bonds. Third, and crucially, it tapped into a huge, unmet global demand for infrastructure investment, particularly in the developing world, that Western countries and institutions had arguably neglected, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. China filled a vacuum.
And the terms of these loans are often different, too.
Yes. BRI loans often carry interest rates closer to commercial levels rather than the highly concessional rates of traditional ODA. And very importantly, they frequently include collateral clauses.
Meaning, if the borrowing country defaults.
China might have contractual rights to take control of the asset itself, the port, the railway, or claim revenues from the country's natural resources. Plus, these loans come with very few political strings attached regarding democracy or human rights, making them highly attractive to many authoritarian or developing country governments who resent Western conditionality.
The Beijing consensus versus the Washington consensus?
In essence, yes. Infrastructure first, politics later, and the scale has just been immense.
How big?
Since around 2009, China emerged as the world's largest bilateral source of development finance, often lending twice as much annually as the U.S. and other major Western lenders combined in many years. This sheer scale has made China the indispensable financier and builder for a huge swath of the globe, creating deep economic ties and significant political leverage along the way. #outro.
Wow. Okay, that was an incredible tour through the mechanics of China's strategy. Emulation, exploitation, entrepreneurship applied across diplomacy, military, and the economy. If you had to boil it all down, synthesize it for our listener, What's the single biggest takeaway from this deep dive into the Upstart strategy?
I think the definitive conclusion is that China's rise wasn't just about economic growth. It was about incredibly shrewd, adaptive, and patient strategic statecraft. They successfully closed the power gap by knowing exactly when to play by the established rules, emulation, to gain access and reassure, when to quietly exploit the gaps and blind spots left by the U.S. exploitation to gain leverage, and when to boldly innovate with their own unique models, entrepreneurship, to leapfrog or bypass Western strength.
And always with two things in mind.
Always balancing effectiveness against two overriding priorities. First, minimizing the risk of provoking a premature, decisive U.S. backlash, and second, ensuring every move ultimately reinforced the Chinese Communist Party's control and stability at home. It was this constant, careful balancing act that allowed them to manage perceptions and delay full U.S. recognition of the challenge until the power differential had shrunk dramatically.
So if China executed an Upstart strategy successfully, the implication is that the U.S., the established power, now needs its own adaptive strategy. What would a U.S. Upstart strategy look like based on this analysis? Does it mean just copying China?
No, definitely not blind emulation. Trying to replicate China's state-led industrial policy, for instance, likely wouldn't work well within the U.S. system and might undermine its own strengths. Instead, the U.S. needs to do two things. First, urgently close the gaps that China exploited. By re-engaging much more seriously, creatively, and consistently with the developing world, offering credible alternatives to BRI, showing up diplomatically, ratifying treaties like UN CLOs to regain influence in bodies like the ISA. Basically, stop leaving vacuums for China to fill.
Okay, close the gaps. What's the second part?
Embrace America's own entrepreneurial strengths. Leverage the advantages that China's authoritarian system inherently lacks.
Such as?
Things like openness to immigration, a smart, merit-based immigration policy to attract and retain global talent is a massive asymmetric advantage the U.S. has over a more closed China. Innovation in military organization and technology sharing with allies, leveraging the trust and network advantages China struggles to build. Doubling down on the strengths of open societies, free markets, and democratic alliances, but adapting them for this new era of competition.
That lays out a clear path forward, adapting to the new reality. It's certainly a lot to think about. Before we wrap up, let's leave our listener with that final provocative thought you mentioned, something to mull over.
Okay. So we spent this whole time talking about competition, strategy, power gaps. It all sounds very zero-sum, potentially leading towards conflict. But here's a different angle to consider. Could this intense competition itself, paradoxically, be a net positive for the world in the long run?
How so?
Well, think about it. This rivalry is forcing both the U.S. and China to push harder than ever before, to innovate technologically at breakneck speed, to invest massively in education and infrastructure, to strive for greater economic efficiency, to constantly refine their governance and institutions to stay competitive. Could it be that this relentless pressure, this race, might actually accelerate global progress in science, technology, maybe even sustainable development benefiting everyone, regardless of which country is technically ahead at any given moment?
So the competition itself becomes the engine driving global advancement, even if the relationship is fraught with tension.
It's a possibility worth considering. That the ultimate outcome might not just be about who wins, but about how the race itself pushes humanity forward.
A fascinating and perhaps slightly more optimistic note to end on. Thank you so much for walking us through this complex and absolutely crucial topic today.
It was my pleasure. A lot to unpack for sure.